National Centre for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, that's ICCOM, where he served until 1971. He also helped to set up and then served on the council of the International Institute for Conservation, IIC, from 1950 until 1971, and he was their president from 1965 to 1968. And the Scottish bit is that for many years Plenderleith was the patron and honorary chair of the Scottish Society for Conservation and Restoration, the SSCR, which is the predecessor to the Island Scotland group. So when Plenderleith died in 1997, at the ripe old age of 99, SSCR established a successful annual public lecture in his memory, which began in 1998. Our invited speakers are leading figures in the conservation, heritage, archaeology or museums and galleries world. And following on from this tradition, tonight we have Liz Davidson, who is the Senior Project Manager of the Mackintosh Building Restoration. Liz graduated from the Edinburgh College of Art as a postgraduate in architectural conservation, and she's been involved in most aspects of Scotland's built heritage. And it is a very long and exciting, prestigious list of stuff. Most recently, she was Head of Heritage and Design at Glasgow City Council, with an active statutory role in maintaining the highest standards of historic building repair and maintenance, in conjunction with encouraging the best and most inspirational designs and contemporary incursions in new development. Previous to this, she led the Heritage Lottery-funded Townscape Heritage Programme to regenerate the merchant city, and her earlier posts have included Director of Glasgow Building Preservation Trust, which is a charitable organisation which has a role in rescuing and bringing back to life numerous historic buildings, including St Andrew's Square Church, Tobacco Merchant's House, Well Park Enterprise Centre, and the iconic blue TARDIS police boxes, which not long ago were threatened with a death by crusher. And while she was at the Trust, Liz also pioneered Doors Open Day, which introduced the UK's first free mass architectural participation event. Liz has also undertaken a 2-year secondment to Historic Scotland, where she led on the development and launch of the multi-million-pound conservation area regeneration scheme, that's the CARS programme, whereby urban areas from Whitehall to Wick have devised programmes of restoration and transformation of some of Scotland's finest historical boroughs. And this has led to wider economic and social regeneration for communities throughout Scotland. Previous to that, casework across Scotland for the Scottish Civic Trust has given Liz an extensive background in local vernacular architecture, in addition to trustee positions on the former Historic Buildings Council for Scotland, the Architectural Heritage Fund and Strathclyde Building Preservation Trust. And there's more. As former chair of the UK Association of Building Preservation Trusts, Liz gained deep insight into both the organisations which seek to raise funding and investment to maintain and restore the country's best architectural inheritances, and those organisations that wish to support those efforts through grants and loan finance. And in 2010, Liz received an OBE for services to conservation and built heritage in Scotland. So we're absolutely delighted to have you here, Liz. Liz is going to speak about After the Dust Has Settled, Rediscovering the Spirit of the Mackintosh.
It's quite a lot. I hope the technology in this works, because there's a couple of moving images in here as well, so we'll just see how it goes, but if not, I shall talk around them. But thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's a really big audience, actually. I didn't quite expect so many, so that's really wonderful. I know some of you are already up at the Whisky Bond, where my colleague Sarah Mcneil, who's the other project manager on the Mackintosh project, and Polly Christie, who's the recoveries person at the archives, have already treated you to a pretty in-depth introduction to what was going on with a couple of the artefacts on the Mac, notably the plaster casts, most of which had survived the first fire, of course, and had been removed, luckily, the lucky few, and also the lights, which hopefully you got to see as well, but I think that maybe it was only about 20 or 30 of you, so I didn't include films of that because I think they had that running already today. So just to talk about what we're doing here, I like that it's a fuzzy image a bit, I'm afraid, but that was kind of the epoch before I started at the Mackintosh, or Sarah for that matter. This is 214, just at the point, I think without a shadow of a doubt, that was probably the next highest point of Glasgow School of Art after the actual opening of or maybe the cutting of the sod for the Mackintosh building itself back in 1897. this was in early 2014 when the Reed building by Stephen Hall had just opened as well, and we're on the cusp of really having a really extraordinary world-class campus with the A-listed Mackintosh on one side and the architect who'd won the gold medal for architecture the year before, I think, in Stephen Hall, the American architect, at the Reed, the other side. And he typifies the buildings as the Mackintosh having a thick skin and thin bones, and the Reed building having a very thin skin and very thick bones. It's obviously cast concrete and glazed panels over that, and our building was really, once you got beyond its stone, it was a timber building. It was a fabulously, wonderfully timber building with all the nuances and the knocks that took, and that's sadly what we have lost. We are currently, somebody handed this in to me, and it was a cartoon in the Herald just in the summer of 2018. You know, we have so very little left of this building now, so it's really hard to feel optimistic a lot of the time, and yet there is hope, as that little cartoon tries to show, I guess, despite the huge losses. After the first fire, and that's just an image from the first fire, the fire brigade had actually done, what I'd like to do, by the way, I should say, is just talk a little bit about where we got to in the first project after the 2014 fire, and why there's hope because of the work, and maybe because of that first fire, what we were able to take stock of, I think, because it destroyed a part of the building, but by no means all. So we had the chance to go in and look at it very holistically and look at the research and actually unpick a lot of the building and the doing, and then look at what we're faced with and left with now after the 2018 fire, and then look at the question of trying to regain that spirit and that aura, I guess, of the Mackintosh itself in going forward, hopefully. This was an image from the first fire. The fire itself really affected the west side of the building. It started down in a basement. Probably know this already, the very good YouTube video about how it spread, actually commissioned by the SFRS, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, who know this building terribly well now, and they're very, they're actually currently in the building doing work on it still, investigating. But at the time of the first fire, they kind of held the line, and that was to do with the fact that the Mackintosh had been built in two halves, to do with funding at the time, so the governors had raised the money in the late 1890s, amazingly had got a brief put out, which was really a matter of pages, nothing much, very broad brush statements from Francis Newbery and the governors, and a building was on site within a couple of years, and it was completed in a couple of years, but only half the building was built. And it took 10 years to fundraise for the second half, and that started in 1907. And this is the bit where the fire started, and it ended in 1909, 2 years later again. And we were actually fortunate in that it did happen on that other side of the building, because the second half of the building in that decade, at the turn of the last century, building Dean of Guild regulations had changed, so you had to have much more cast iron beams within the building, you had to have more flow separation with concrete floors. There was a whole range of things that had come in because of factory fires and others in the city, in places like Dundee, etc. So there was lots more put in to avoid progressive collapse or anything within the building and the spread. So, and that half actually formed the main compartment in the building as well, I guess, because it was stopped on that midline. And really what we lost was obviously awfully the library itself. Pretty well everything you see there was lost, but as some of you will have seen today, the lights, which are the metal element in the room, I guess, collapsed onto the floor, was smothered, was smashed completely, and were horribly twisted. But that is a piece of work that's been ongoing since the fire. What did happen was the results of a very impressive disaster recovery plan, actually after 2014, and it did swing into action. And I hope Polly and Sarah have told more about it to you today. But there was a huge network. It was over the May Bank Holiday weekend in 2014, and a network just swung into place. And people came up from the north of England, Harwells were involved down south, anything shipped down to them, and items frozen and taken away because the water, of course, had done more damage than the actual fire. And where the losses were, it was in the library, but even then there were finds, and there were something like a dozen books entirely unscathed as well, that again were frozen and brought back and would have taken pride of place in the library. And of course, with things like books, arguably, they are copies, not just one has been made of them, so there was a big ongoing campaign from the library section of GSA to put calls out. They knew what they had, they put calls out, and a lot of those replica copies were coming back in to the library, and we would have restocked it and more again. So it was an exciting project really, because we had lost, after getting over the shock of losing the library, which was just a terrible, gut-wrenching shock, we were not allowed to call it a catastrophe because, in fact, well, apart from the fact nobody was hurt, thankfully in either fire, but it was about 15 to 17% of the building that we actually lost, and the rest of it was smoke damage, but not as badly damaged. But the building that it was affecting was a beautiful library there on the right hand side, these wonderful Bedford-Lemaire images, and I don't know if anybody's here from Historic Environment Scotland, but the then Royal Commission on Ancient Historic Monuments were very good with us and actually gave us access to the plate negatives. I think, Kevin Shaw, you went through, didn't you, Kevin, to see them over in Edinburgh, and we were able to look at the things that had bled off the sides of the plate and zoom in with, I don't know what level of accuracy, but extraordinary accuracy in terms of these images. And Kevin, being a lighting engineer, I won't pick on you anymore, Kevin, you sit here in the front row. We're particularly interested in the lighting, particularly in items like fixing and the bulbs and the bayonets, etc., and what was being used there. But we could go right into these images and look at things like the treatment of the wood and where the pipe runs were for the conduits, very expressed pipe runs, which was interesting to us. And in fact, Page and Parker, the architects, got down to looking at the scratch marks on the floor of the library. So these were taken just after completion of the library, certainly within the 12 months of completion of the building in about 1910. So it was brand new. It was kind of dressed from photographs in some cases by Bedford-Lemaire, who took a lot of images for Country Life and others around that time, and was working for Honeyman and Keppie at the time as well. Keppie Hanson. And at that time, of course, Mackintosh a partner. And there was very, very interesting things when you looked at the grain of the wood and how he'd even used grain and toolings and markings on stone and on plaster. The texture of the building was coming alive to us in a way that I don't think people had really ever looked at it. In recent years, the plaster was a case in point. A lot of it, and the wood as well, actually, had been slasted over with a lot of paint over the years, or varnishes or lacquers, and all of that was being re-exposed to us. And when we started examining these, we could see just how careful Mackintosh had been in his use of plaster, where he used smooth plaster, or where he used a very rough plaster, and it was very deliberate. And again, in the door cases around the main studios, beautifully polished door cases around there's at the Mac Room and other studio doors, but the main run of studio boarding would have been very much rough, hewn off the saw planking. So it wasn't just about using a cheaper material, it was definitely about texture and what he wanted to achieve in the building. And just again, his use of light, which is fairly extraordinary, as you can see there with the top-lit studios, Studio 58 at the top of the building above the library there on the top right, which had light from every direction, top light, west light there in those little 3 punched windows. It had borrowed light through a glazed door on the north elevation. It had west light through a door into a conservatory behind the photograph, and then it had south light from that large window, which was on top of the library tower, effectively. And we did a lot of work again, just looking at the extraordinary use of how he, and I should ask him to this from how, it would be unfair. But in how he slung the lights around, and you could cluster them over an object or tilt them or spin them out if you're working on different easels. And my favourite studio, actually, Studio 48 at the other side of the building, the Embroidery Studio, where you had the top lantern, which was added in 1907, 1909 to expand that earlier phase of the building, and then his modulating the use of the light coming in. So this is north light here, and then the very, very strong southern light, but that's due south and towering over everything else. Nothing is going to block that light coming in, and even in the winter you'd get amazingly strong sunlight and heat coming into the building through these little windows. So they're punched openings on that fantastic Harald rear elevation. And I just love that studio. And in fact, it had been altered at the time of the first fire, even because because you have to walk through it literally from the hen run. It had had a corridor space added on there, so it didn't look like that. And that's an option, I guess, because that's certainly God knows with so many other things. When the project did get underway, I'm aware I'm talking to a room full of conservators and people involved in historic buildings. We really did assemble, through the contractor, an amazing team at every level of the project. So we had Sterling Stone working on the stonework throughout the building, but most engaged in the library elevation where all the stonework had been really shattered, and they just did an extraordinary job of piecing together those very, very tall library windows. And it was like a piece of Jenga. Most of the levels of the stone were built up of 3 massive stones interlocking and twisting their way up the building. The stonemason who was mainly involved in this, and he did it from the very start to the very end, Jim Hay from Stirling Stone, phenomenal stoneworker. He had found out just by, I don't think it was on the drawings, but he'd found out that we were about a foot in old money apart. If you took a straight line up from the base stone to the top, it not only moved by about 12 inches, 15 inches, but it actually twisted before you got to the top, so there was something like that going on. And he just made the most minute calculation on every single stone, so when he got to that last penultimate stone, he was millimetre accurate in putting that in, and you wouldn't see it. There was no entasis or anything. It was actually just, it looked like straight, but if you dropped a plumb line down from the very top of the stone to the very bottom, and it went through 3 stories, the library, the balcony, and the bookstore above, you'd have seen just the gap it was when it came to the bottom. And he just figured it out. He just kept on just slightly twisting and slightly cutting and slightly narrowing, and it was just inch perfect, or millimetre perfect, I should say. But these wonderful huge stones that were coming up and being again slotted into position, all slung up by hand and hoists and threaded through the very intricate scaffold we had on that side of the building. And this was a great moment when we were able to start thinking about taking off the temporary roof, when we started to put back in those the professor's studios at the very top, the big lantern top floor of the building, and again feeding in the beams through the scaffold and very quickly getting a roof onto it. And an even better day in June of 2017 when we were able to start, there's quite a lot of photos in there I'm afraid, but when about 4 or 5 different sets of people were working in terms of the skills together. So we had the stonemason cutting sockets into the gables on Studio 58, these huge hunks of timber coming through, yellow pine coming in with the joiners just cutting and shaping and lifting them into space and knocking them in and forming just this fantastic Japanese style Shinto temple kind of effect in the building. The scaffolders running around the scaffold and unzipping the roof to feed things in, and the crane operators working blind to somebody down here and shouting down the instructions. And it was really just everyone coming on board, and not long after that, having got the big beam structure in, then the glaziers and the roofers coming on board and the lead workers to put the roof over. It was a very, very fast operation, with a lot of it obviously assembled off-site or pre-assembled up to a point and then brought in, but just went like clockwork. Very, very impressive day when a huge amount was achieved. Inside the building, this is on the other side of the building, behind over the map room, where we had lath and plaster being used. And there's a lot of debate about things like, should we be using chestnut ribbon lath or should we be using plasterboard? And it's a topic I'll come to just towards the end, but it's very much about saying that there's a sound that comes from a room that's done in lath and plaster and with lime plaster and horsehair that is a different sound to to a solid wall or to a plasterboard wall, to a wooden wall. It was about getting the acoustic back. So although this was a hard one, we hadn't budgeted for this, we hadn't really thought about this. This was one of those spin-offs from the fire, because this is on the east side of the building. It wasn't affected by the fire. There was smoke contamination throughout the building, but in receiving in the first fire a settlement from the insurance company, which is where you get a bag of money as opposed to them following you through and saying, well, the carpet wasn't that colour, the stain wasn't that big, when you need to do that carpet tile, we'll give you the money for that carpet tile. They actually decided, there's the money, go away, it's too complicated, and we had the money to try and just eke it out throughout the building. And that's what we were doing. So we did decide we wanted to put the studio back, which is a very plain studio actually. It was the inaccessible studio on the east side of the building up a half landing. It was always an interesting one to find in the degree show times, and people would sneak away in there. But we did this fantastic thing, and it looks like a quilted mattress inside. It was a very beautiful space, and it did get plastered before the fire. The work of the plasterers, which was a company called Ornate down in Leeds, I think we were down to 2 main plastering operations in the end, and we ended up with Ornate. Either would be great, we had a Scottish plasterer as well, kind of lined up, was phenomenal. And this is some of the it's hard to see in that photograph, but the texture of that, what they were doing there, the way they were, you can see every single line there is softened. Mackintosh himself had softened the stonework coming in, so all these are not hard arises like there, but on the outside they curve just very beautifully around the windows, so he's softening the light and bringing it in, and when it got to the ceilings again, it's this lovely softening of very quite rough plaster work when you got up there, but they were just working as they went along. This is the sadly non-operating at the time mist suppression system that was coming into the building as well through it. But the plasterwork was superb quality throughout the building. And on the back, the Harling was being redone on the original brick, and this is the hen room coming in and getting built into space. So that scaffold had long since dropped, actually. That's, again, probably about an hour since, sorry, a year or so before the fire. Small alterations were being made. So here at the top, these were 4 linked studios, and we had decided here that we could achieve, if anyone knew the Mackintosh, before 2014 there was a step up from the loggia into what were the head of fine arts studios, and they become studios and offices for senior staff. And there was a step up, so we kept the step, but we were able to take this little ramp along it because just the way it was being formed, and we were putting a hidden door in here that we wouldn't have seen from inside the studio. It would have just looked like the rest of the wall. But again, that's the work of the plasterers and the joiners, which were a Dunfermline firm, JCG, wonderful old timers, as well as new apprentices coming on and working together and finding out things about duking axes and how to put things into the wall, so the dukes actually corkscrewed in like a propeller into the wall, and there was just one man teaching everybody, and suddenly everyone had got it and they were doing it. So it was very much those traditional skills, but they were pretty fast as well to use. You know, it wasn't that we were doing it as slow and beautiful. They were just good experienced craftspeople working at a pace that was completely commensurate with the rest of the project. And we were getting down to doing the kind of paint samplings on the wall. There was colour in the building. All of these we decided were too dark, but there was grey in some of the upper studios, there was blues and there were reds and there were greens, which we were uncovering because of the fire, which we really didn't know about before to that extent. And this is again one of the finished rooms. This was a room that was horrible before the first fire. It was the counselling suite, and it had 3 little offices against the window, nasty little offices, and a corridor going down one side of it. And it's, if you only had a minor problem, you'd be in the first room, and if you were, you know, in quite a bad state, you'd be in the 3rd room down the bottom, and it had it, where it was. And this is where we were bringing this building back, putting the boarding was there, but it had been covered over with MDF and whatever over the years. The windows were all there anyway. Again, putting the plastering back in. It was mainly Vesta smoke detection that was coming into the building, so we were not getting any of the, we'll do it on the ceilings here, you know, we weren't getting any of the little smoke detectors and things, which is fine. I have no problem with them, but it's nice if you can avoid having them at all. So here it was all an active system, the Vesta system, which is constantly sniffing the air for any particle of smoke. And just a lovely quality again, plasterwork, woodwork, painting, everything. That would have been a really beautiful little studio, and made accessible through an intervention here where we were knocking through into the shaft of the lift, which meant that not only this space became accessible in the building, but also the bookstore, which was further along from it and had been lost in the fire. Stained glass was being put back into the building. This was the door to the men's loose, and I'm saying no more. But it is quite, I do have to go back to it actually in a way, because one of the things I shouldn't even be here at the moment. I mean, he was cheeky, Mackintosh, there's no doubt he was cheeky. It was the men's cloakroom. And it's interesting what was happening. I mean, neither myself or any of my colleagues who met this afternoon should have been here now. We would have finished work at the end of October. The school would have had they were very judiciously keeping myself and my quite small team on from the project finishing, which should have been in March of this year, 2019, through to September, October in fact, because it wanted a bedding in period that allowed the students to come back in September, have a month of using the building and telling us what was wrong with it. And we were warned, you know, you will get students saying we need more blanket, you'll get students saying we want more sunlight, you'll get students saying they want more electrical points for all the gadgets and Wi-Fi, etc. You get tutors saying they don't want any flow boxes because it limits what they can do, they trip over them. And then one of the biggest things we're facing from the student body itself, sorry, I'm not speaking to the mic here, is and it's just very interesting because it's just how the times are moving on, is for a building where Newbury had made a Mackintosh, but I'm sure it came from the governors, or certainly from Newbury actually, maybe not from the governors. When you see the governors quoting it, it's all worthy men. But it was about having equal provision for male and female, which would be unusual in the day really, because obviously institutional buildings and working buildings and universities, I mean, I don't think Glasgow University admitted women until the late 1890s. So women in education and higher education, this had equal provision for male and female toilets, and what the students wanted was to take that away altogether for 2019 and have obviously gender neutral. But Mackintosh had other ideas. He was putting up something in there that said, you know, well, if you want, but I'm not giving it my same glass. And the library, of course, which we had built a full-scale prototype of in Edinburgh, in the makers of the library, Lawrence Mackintosh in Edinburgh, wonderful craftspeople. Mrs. Gus at the top of the library. We had Sarah Gerrish, who had, I don't know if any of these people are here tonight, so Sarah Gerrish had done work already on the library for us, pre the 214 fire, and so we knew things about the colour, and also the colour of the wood, etc. And it's a much lighter wood. It's tulip wood, which is what the library originally was made of. It came through from America, was seasoned and already, thankfully, and then had been pre-assembled. So we'd asked them to do a full-scale prototype, which also involved, obviously, these, this is dying on me, I think, these extraordinary pendants, and one man was busy doing all of that. Now, luckily, the prototype still exists, and that is, you know, a wonder in itself. So that is off-site and still at Lawrence Mackintosh. But the real library, we had got as far as the carcass of it and the ceiling, etc. We had not installed these wonderful pendants. So the one on the left is an original from pre-214. The one on the right is what Martin's, the carver through in Edinburgh, had been doing. So they're all complete and they're all safe, which is good, as are the balustrades. Anyway, sadly in 218, that happened. And this is footage from I don't know how much later, I think it was about 1 in the morning, and we know the fire started somewhere around 11 or 12 o'clock on that Friday night. So it took hold pretty quickly by the look of it, and it's quite scary footage. This was taken from the roof of Blytheford House, and you can see, we're only looking at half the building there really. You can see the museum with its very distinctive outline here. You can see the sheer ferocity of that fire and the way it was all over the building. And the next morning, that's what we all woke up to. Those of us got to bed, and again from the same view, and it was still burning, but this time I think the O2, which is the nightclub down at the west end of the site, was still smouldering as well. And the view from one of the nearby buildings just to show us this was the state of it was. So there was a real concern that we would be for sure losing this building, and this may or may not be. So I'll just leave this on for a second while I'm talking. This was the drone footage, and this is one of the differences that happened in the second project, I guess. We were very quick. Within 24 hours we had somebody offering us the services of a drone to go over and look at the building. It was really vital we had this, because there's no way we could go into the building. The fire brigade had saved the building to a point, but basically they'd had to leave it burn out. There was nothing left to burn really. So all the timber had been destroyed, and there was a real concern, particularly at this point, of that side of the building and that tenement opposite, where folks had done the usual push out to the right as you're looking at that there, and then the expansion back in after the water from the firefighters. So there was worry about the stone of that gable collapsing out into Dalhousie Street. And the council had, as you can see, evacuated the entire area. So the school was put out of the Reed and the Borden, the CCA were put out. Businesses, even on Sockhill Hall Street, were evacuated in case there was a tumbling down into Sockhill Hall Street. And the folk in the Dalhousie Street tenement were taken out as well. And they were out, we couldn't let them anywhere near back the building for 8 weeks until the scaffolding was built to hold that up. So we had a very large fight in our hands to save the building at all. And the fortunate thing was we had been on site, we knew this building extremely well. We had wonderful engineers, David Narrow Associates, who were on site they came through that evening. And as I say, things like drone footage. And within a matter of hours, they were able to start making calculations that would normally have taken weeks. The other thing that assisted them a lot was the fact that through the school we'd already scanned the building in what was the School of Simulation and Visualization. So pre-214 there'd been scans taken of the building, point cloud data images. Post-214 other images were made, and immediately we got them back in again to say, is this able going to collapse. That was the point of real worry, I think, for us with that particular gable. It looked okay, but in fact it had shifted quite considerably. And as you can see in that last image, actually, we started, the scaffolding had come down because that was finished, that gable. We were dropping all the scaffold because the building was just getting so near to completion. So that point cloud data allowed us to actually go back to building control and say, no, there's been that much movement, it isn't going to collapse, but for safety, nevertheless, and you can see the damage there to the O2 nightclub in the foreground, we will throw a raking scaffold on that elevation, double quick. The other thing it allowed us to look at was any movement anywhere else on the building, even within the site. And this gable was of concern. It's got this lovely stone, which you'd only see if you actually were up on well, properly anyway, because of the sight lines, I guess, to this part of the building. If you were up on that scaffold, it's a beautiful shallow dish, kind of tulip-shaped stone at the very top. And so that was a worry for us, because that particular staircase, of course, was added it was all Risbon jointed, because it had been added in 1909 to link the building, and that's why the Mac room always had those exterior windows facing into the stairs. So it had been bolted onto the building, but not bonded as tightly as the other one, which had been built as part of it. So we were worried about that, but it allowed us to work with the demolition crew, and you can see just how much it's pushed out in the bottom left corner there to save that stone very quickly before anything else collapsed. A lot of the stuff was lifted off site. If it was lifted off site, it got a tagging, and Tom Simmons, who works alongside us, and he was a traditional skills officer, quickly his role changed pretty well overnight to become the salvage operator. So he came up with this fairly nifty, chalk would be no good in a situation as robust as this. So these are cattle tags, barcoded, and every barcode is numbered onto an elevation, but if they're robust enough for bullocks in the field, they're robust enough for scaffolders and demolition contractors who are taking them off. So that was a nifty system we quickly kind of put into place. Fire brigade, obviously, and then very quickly we have to throw that up, and all credit to SGB Scaffolding, who put that left-hand scaffolding up over a weekend. And they had to, because at that point the council were getting such political pressure and local pressure for demolition to get rid of the encumbrance and the nuisance, that we were getting very, very heavy pressure from the council to sort it. Once we'd got that up, it would have taken a long time for them to have issued a demolition order on grounds of safety, because they'd have to dismantle the scaffold to make it dangerous again, so that wouldn't have looked anything clever. But I mean, we understood everyone's intense worries about it. There was genuine worry about public safety, and of course the impact of it in terms of finishing that so that people could get back to their homes was really important to the local community, who had an awful summer, I think, about for obvious reasons. At the top of the building, what they had to do then was to basically, as I say, push in a lot of that masonry. We didn't have time to lift everything off site, so a lot was pushed in. Where the structure itself had begun to just be held, girdled really by that scaffold, we were then able to have a bit more time to go in and do some internal wailings and strapping within the building, which meant we didn't have to do quite so much on the outside. Again, a maybe system, if you know M-A-B-E-Y, that's not right, yes it is, was put into on top of the building, designed by DNA. So this was the building after the fire, sadly, and you can see just how much of that stonework with the library piers, again, the thing that Jim had worked so hard to get aligned, had been destroyed, and this time we completely lost the gable to Studio 58. So pushed into the building, and we opted to clamp the top of the building really to keep it like that. But that's the state of the stonework on those piers now, so a lot of that will be utterly lost. In a structural role, but potentially we can still recut a lot of the stone and use it again, and that's the system from on top of the building. So that's kind of holding it from on top. And sadly, the library that had been so wonderfully crafted, that's us looking again through bookstore and right down to where you see the curving brickwork is the floor of the library. So again, lost. And the tensions and the forces of what went on in that fire are just so unlike what we faced after 214. So that is what the structure itself was trying to cope with, and it had to give somewhere. So you can just see it was writhing through. And what we've got in that bottom layer, I guess, is just all the scaffolding, all the pipework, all the there was so much going on because of things like plastering getting on and also mist suppression getting put onto ceilings and wirings. There was a lot of access scaffolds, and trying to unpick that and get rid of all the steel work when you're doing it is a terrible job for them. But you can see there's kind of strengthening around the windows and picking through at the moment. That's the kind of corridor as it was about 3 weeks ago. Just yesterday, we've cleared that corridor, and immediately, we're talking relatively here, but the building is starting to come back. It was actually a very exciting moment to walk in and along the main access corridor, but a very strange moment. What we have there is almost a canyon-like shaft going down the middle of the building. So it is heartbreaking to see for all involved. The only thing that's actually survived okay is the brickwork in the building, and I suppose you would guess that from how it's made in the first place, but stonework suffered. Anything organic has obviously just totally gone, and these were useful plans. Again, what we were able to do for Rygot, the contractor on the site, was say that in these areas going vertically down, we know, so we've looked at everything on plan, anything that is of value that might be in has dropped here, here and here, and the men have been amazing, so we just plotted it in terms of vertical drops in through these shafts. As I say, brickwork survived pretty well. Metalwork will survive, we know that from the history of the lights in the library. And I think there are various conservation charters. We tend to keep going back to the fairly original of this kind of conservation charter, and it becomes more and more relevant in many ways to us at the moment in terms of we were on a restoration project. We were restoring the library and bringing it, well, we weren't restoring, we were reproducing, I suppose, the library, but exactly. We were restoring the rest of the building and finding some amazing things and having wonderful joy in the building. Between 2014 and 2018, it's now a reconstruction without any shadow of a doubt, and there will be questions about how this is done this time, and it might well be done differently. We don't know. As I say, brick has obviously survived quite well. That's again just the other day, and we will be able to reuse it. And of course, the building was made of a lot of brick, and the rear elevation, bless Mackintosh, is very. It lends itself beautifully to that cladding and that cloaking of it in the Portland cement that he used on the rear elevation and in parts of the sides. But we do know that the metalwork survived. That was the first bit that came off the building. We asked Ryder to go up even before we had permission to get a crane there and lift off the finials, so they're safe and actually quite undamaged. These are obviously from the workman's boots, the metal-soled boots, so as I say, the metal will survive. We have found the door plates, and we know, as I say, from the work that the wonderful Lonsdale and Dutch have been doing on the lights for the library, we know we'll be able to bring these back and repair them, and they will be, well, hopefully as good as new, which is hard to believe, but it can be done. Studios like Studio 11, this lovely Japanese space that was down at the basement level, these are important because although that timber beam work has disappeared completely, these beautiful angle brackets that were in holding up the roof there, and each one differently curved, organically curved, and almost certainly instructed by Mackintosh. There's no drawing about it, but instructed on site. They have survived. I've been in, and they're all there, and the metal will be fine. So we've asked the guys that's on site at the moment to look out for the coat of arms, because that was in situ. The bell had been taken off. You can see the hook there. That had gone anyway into storage as part of the works, but that will be there, and we will find it, I'm sure. And for those folk who weren't at the Whiskey Bomb, this is a very short couple of demonstrations about the library lights. So this was the AOC Conservators had come in. We've got Adiman on the job this time round, but we had AOC and Kirkdale Archaeology working in the first project, and Kirkdale had prepared a grid of the library, and these were the lights were hung originally, and then found. The only one we didn't find was where the floor had collapsed, which is where the fire was going through a vertical vent at that point, and it was in the old librarian's office, so we never found that one because it would have gone down to the floor below, and we didn't know at the time to look on the floor below, which is a shame. But all the others of the lights were found, then put into a kit of parts because they'd just fallen apart with the solder, and laid out. So we made up the kit of parts, and Polly and Sarah, who some of you met today, were really busy on this work. Even pieces of glass were found. There were drawings. There was new pieces made where we needed new pieces by Rodney, and that is a new light. So it's a mixture of parts in some cases. Where it's new, so I can't see from this angle, he's put a stamp on it. just Lonsdale and Dutch, so we always know that. But you really could have the old light and the new light side by side, and you wouldn't know. And Sue Bradbury of Stained Glass Workshop, I don't know if Sue's here, but was wonderful in having done some work on the lights anyway, in the stained glass of the building, and had copies of the stained glass from, I can't remember the name of a place that's now out of business, but Sue's here, she would tell me, down south, and we were able to get the right glass to put back in the light. So they are all safe, they are all in store, and they will come back in. Likewise, Rollins Mackintosh have all the balusters, and they even have the screen, because this was all waiting to go in, so that work that's off-site and will kind of go back. They were also looking at the chair, and this is something we would have probably fed round more than one craftsman, the library furniture, but that was the original chair, and there's one left which is that we know of, which is in private ownership, which we borrowed and took measurements of, the Windsor chair. There was a lot of debate about this at the time. It'll probably happen again if we put them back in, because they're very low. They're just a bit lower than a chair is normally, and they're just a bit narrower. But they're, for me, great, and they're really good for holding your arms when you're reading something like a big newspaper or something. So I think they should go back in. As I say, this is the other woodworking store at Rollins Mackintosh. The clocks are still in store, which is important. And Gus, who you saw on the prototype of the library, we brought him through one day. So this is up at the Whiskey Bond. So they were off-site. We lost one because there was one painted onto a wall. Other than that, they're all fine. And it was interesting bringing in Gus, because he was able to say to us, what you've got here is a plank of wood and a plank of wood, and then we couldn't understand where the bits of wood here were the grain ran a different way. So there's a piece there and a piece there, and you can't really see it from that angle. But what's happened is that somebody's taken a slice off here, flipped it, put it there. It doesn't look it here, I know, but they've flipped it, and it's the same at the top as well. So maybe it's just my angle, but anyway, that height is that length, if you understand. So it's the same piece of wood, and they've just cut it off and put it up here. And it was just understanding how that had been put together. A very cheap thing to do, he was explaining. But again, just Mackintosh being brilliant. We have the door numerals, and again, these will be remade. So I think the thing now, the final part is, can we reconstruct, I'm watching my time, the Mackintosh. I was reading a lovely piece of work that was in our library the other day, and I'm going to shamelessly crib from it, and it's by a student called Mcneil, who I've never met, but he'd written a piece all about phenomenology, which is the phenomena. You will know better than me, and I didn't know anyway. It's about the senses and the taste. And so D. Stephen Hall, when he was designing the Reed building, said that, a building is no use if you just stand outside and look at it on the street. That's nothing, that's not architecture. You have to go inside the building, and you have to see if it encourages you to dream, or if it makes you happy or sad or evokes emotions. And a piece of architecture is not architecture just from the street. There's so much architecture nowadays, you get an impression of it, how it will look in the street and what the front elevation is. That's not a building. And what phenomenology is where a human being reacts to the touch, to the smell, to the place, the experience. And I think the Mackintosh, that's our question. Can we capture that spirit of the building? Because it was an extraordinary building for all of us who've had the fortune to have gone inside it. Now even the people are different, and I've counted there are 4 non-people in that picture, or maybe they were at one time. But even the people are different, the students are different, so they will experience it differently. There are things that people have expected in those days. The smell will be different because it's all eco-cleaning products now, and it wouldn't be bleach everywhere or urine in some places to clean the stairs, etc. Well, it might now be urine to clean the stairs, actually, with a lot of the students. Actually, that may have come back around. Touch, the surface and the pattern, and that's been spoken about a lot. We were not going to fake up the library once it came back. We were going to allow the students to do that. But that sincerity, as it says there, about the space itself, and the fact you can touch it and feel it, and has it got knocks and bumps in it, we're not wanting to fake it. But now we're talking about a whole building, and just the scruffiness of it. A lot of that would have still been there because we couldn't afford to do the whole building, and we rather liked it, the scratches and everything. Smell, I've actually put that one in because in terms of the prototype, not because of Angus, because he's a very hygienic joiner, but because what we found in doing it was that, and I don't know if you know that, but we had Crichton Ian Crichton and Smith, was it? I can't remember, that's terrible. Cricksmith, up from Leicester, I think, to look at the paint surfaces throughout the map. Also Sarah Garish had done some work as well from more locally. And what they found in the library though was that the nearest they could get to the surface treatment was the rubbing in of a very intense, almost an oil paint. So it wasn't a stain, it wasn't a paint, it wasn't a covering, it was something that was rubbed in like a shoe polish almost into it. And the entirety of the Mackintosh woodwork had been done by hand by Lawrence Mackintosh, with a man with a big mix of this paint that had been made up specially and was rubbing in a mix of burnt umber and another, which I've forgotten what it is now, but it was coming out in a beautiful, it was sitting on the surface, but it was also revealing the grain, allowing us to read the material of the wood. And there was an amazingly wonderful smell in that was coming through in the building because it would be in wax, etc. So that would have been lovely. And they were just little hidden things. I don't know if anybody ever saw that, but it was just a little cupboard in one of the ground floor where a horrible door had been put on it in one place. And I opened it one day with a torch and realised that the inside had been painted gold. I said, now that probably wasn't original gold, I don't know, but it was just a lovely little thing there which is now gone, but we have the images, I suppose. This is the library after the first fire when we just done the clean out. And certainly the noise, even in that space, in its 3 height space, was extraordinary. But once you put the library carcass in, it began to alter it. It gave it such intimacy, that library with its shadows and its spaces where you thought it could be really quite tranquil in a busy library. And the beauty, of course, now, the beauty would have been in that new library coming back in is that it had no preciousness. So we would be able to go in and use it and touch it and everything in a way it hadn't been just before the 214 fire, I suppose. And just generally the light that comes in through the Mackintosh, that is still there. The light is still there. The way he handled light was just something different to anything I've ever come into. And again, this is, we were speaking at the end of his dissertation, and it kind of sums it all up. And it was magic. There was a magic in that building. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And you couldn't write it or draw it up. You had to experience it. People have tried a lot, but you just had to be in the space. And we have lost beautiful little things like that little gold cupboard. But this was up on the as you came out the library on those booths, there was just a pane of glass, and it was only legible after the first fire because the soot had got into the scratch. And we protected always in situ, but we don't know if that survived. I mean, it's quite a hard one to think if it will. Again, after the first fire, there was little imprints of books on the cupboard, and it took us a while to figure out what that was, and then we found that on Amazon, and I didn't know the book, but it was a beautifully illustrated book by, I forget the first name, it's Richard or Reginald Caldecott. But even that has been saved, that was out, but those little moments in time, I suppose. And finally, the plasticus, you will have heard a little bit about today, but just to say that at the time, Graciela Ainsworth was doing magnificent work on the plasticus. So we had lost only 1 or 2, which were in the library. The Cantoria panels had been very badly burnt. They were outside the library, and you may have seen them today if you went out to the Whiskey Bond. But what she was doing was conserving and consolidating them, and the techniques and the range of techniques that were being used were extraordinary. So for Leacune, the sculpture here, this is the one in the Vatican, I think, is the marble copy of something from Mesopotamia. They were injecting in resin, I think, using, I don't know the name of the girl I spoke to earlier from Graciela's, but is Graciela here? She was going to come through.
Yes.
Hello, Graciela. Yeah, I should get you up and I guess welcome. I'll need to see you afterwards. But they had this wonderful A&E room spectacle in the building, and I should have brought along a picture of it, where all the statues, or a lot of the statues, because you didn't know what was going on inside them, and they were all slightly different. They had those medical things that you move around hospital wards with kind of blood bags on it, and I think you bought them from a zombie blood shop or something. Or the NHS would be happy for you to sell you the real thing, and you wouldn't need blood in them, obviously. You're actually putting in resin of some kind or whatever. Again, you'll correct me, I'm sure, but don't do it in public. But it just looked like a hospital ward, and these incredible statues were just being made safe again and then left black and very, very beautiful. But sadly we were doing that in situ because they were really too big and too fragile to move, so they were being protected in the building. What's coming through at the end, I'm 55 minutes in this counter, so I'm very near the end, I've got about 4 slides. is that we had art projects revolving around that, and this was one of them where one of our art master students had looked at the whole issue of copy and replication and authenticity, and she had had a 3D copy made on the right hand side, I think, of 3D printing, and then had cast one in plaster, and then had cast one in bronze, which it was originally, and allowed it to go to pattern it, and then painted over like the fire and things like this. And it was a topic of a lot of really interesting debate about the authenticity and the importance of the real thing. Of course, Edinburgh College of Art have a lot of the same casts that we have, but they were very beautiful objects, particularly after the fire. And the more digitally interesting way that's happening recently is the fact that we are looking at the augmented reality and virtual reality aspect. So luckily, the School of Simulation and Visualization had also scanned Lighthouse, and there's an extraordinary piece of work now that goes on where you can stand in a studio, put on one of these headsets, walk around the art school and hear the story of Lighthouse. And this may or may not work. It probably, I don't think I think it may have sound, which would be a bad thing. So I'm not going to let it play for too long, but just give you a flavour of it. It does have sound, but actually...
This is Laocoon. Legend has it he was a Trojan priest who, along with his 2 sons, was attacked by sea serpents sent by the gods. The story's most iconic depiction is a marble sculpture from ancient Greece that is now in the Vatican that many believe to be a copy of an earlier bronze work. You are looking at a plaster replica of the central figure that existed in the Glasgow School of Art's Mackintosh building. From the time of its rediscovery, copies of Laocoon and his sons were made in marble and in plaster. Many were used for teaching drawing and anatomy in art schools where collections of casts were wheeled between studios for students to work from. As drawing from casts fell out of fashion, many were destroyed. At Glasgow School of Art, however, Laocoon and other plaster casts were retained and were familiar figures in the school's corridors. In May 2014, this cast was badly damaged in the fire that ravaged the west end of the famous Mackintosh building. As if attacked by the gods again, the intense heat and smoke transformed Laocoon's marble white plaster surface to a sooty, blistered black. A decision was made to conserve the plaster cast, given its importance in art education and also its history as part of the GSA collection. The first step was to examine Laocoon and establish how it was made so it could be strengthened.
We'll leave this run actually, because it is quite interesting.
And they had become something else. They really, really had become something else. They were already stunning. To think people had cast these from amazing sculptures and they'd survived all these years until now, until this point. And then there was a fire, and suddenly the fire had turned them into something completely different again. We didn't know whether he was solid or hollow, so we had to work out how is the consolidator going to penetrate the plaster itself. We drilled holes into the Laocoon's body. One was to allow the endoscope to go in, so we could see all around the inside of the cast, but then we could use sim holes to actually spray the consolidant, so we could use a tool to go through those holes. So we could use those holes for as many purposes as possible, and we could then check how the consolidation was doing with the endoscope.
It's so incredible here and absolutely magnetic. It's almost as if Laocoon, or this copy of a copy of a copy, has reverted to the original that has been lost to recent time. And so we have a slice of that original experience, because this dark colour is actually the pattern that the bronze would have assumed.
The conservation work made value of Laocoon's transformation, preserving the surface like a darkened bronze. This beautiful copy, unique in its appearance, was stored in the Mackintosh building because of its size and fragility. Sadly, it perished in the fire of June 2018. But does this mean it is lost? Our version may only exist in this intangible digital space. But could this be considered a faithful copy of the plaster cast? which was a copy of the Vatican marble, which was possibly a copy of a lost bronze. Our conserved Laocoon exists as point cloud data, and this can be transformed back into visible material through 3D printing. It can be rendered and textured in a limitless number of materials, rescaled or replicated infinitely. Would such an object be any less authentic than any of the other copies made over the past 2,000 years, in print, in sculpture, or in plaster? The Laocoon lives on.
It was actually worth, I think, letting that run. This is my penultimate slide. I'm 101 on my document. I think it is just to say thank you. We are currently hoping that there are many ways in which the spirit, the reality, the hope, the faith of the Mackintosh building will survive. It's still a strong building. It's still standing there in its eco-skeleton, I guess. The other thing we've spoken to the school about, or half of the school, but you know, my belief certainly is that in bringing it back, as we hope, we know we can do, we know the skills are there to do so, and we've shown that through the first project, and the knowledge is now there, more than it ever has been before. We would like to think that there is a look to the future, and that the fact that we are in a place where this building, when it comes back, so innovative in its time, through all sorts of things, through lighting, through humidity control, air conditioning, through its creation of social spaces, its beautiful use, that merging of the arts and crafts with the modernists, should be looking towards technology and the sustainability agenda in a way that it was doing, but could do so much better this time, as an exemplar of something that talks about his great love, actually, of gardens and of plants and of growth and of organic forms, but put into something that actually feeds back to something that is a very extraordinary building in terms of how it faces up to climate change as well. And I won't go into that, that's another lecture, but there's a lot of very exciting thought around that. Where we're left with at the moment is that this was the little thing that happened to the statue, the Kenny Hunter statue. It said the Central Hotel in 2014. And that was put on it just after, which was rather nice, after the 2018 fire, to bring us back to that cartoon. We're really hopeful if we bring together the skills which we know exist in Scotland and wider afield, the right people who have got the same mix, I think, of a level of humility to the wonder of this building and what he found, but also the real chutzpah of the man himself, you know, and the sense of fun and mischief. If you bring that, if you capture that spirit and the sincerity and the integrity to do it, there's no reason that this building couldn't be another absolutely extraordinary world-class building for Scotland. So I'd just like to leave it on that note. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name's Sarah Closs, I'm the Chief Executive for Icon, and I have the delightful task of saying thank you to Liz. It's always an absolute joy and privilege to listen to Liz talk, because she has such passion, such enthusiasm, and it's so very eloquent in the way you talk about the building, not just as a thing, a concoction of parts, but in the way it smells and the way it sounds, in that really human thing about what it is to be in the space. And I think she's really brought that alive for us tonight. But most importantly, I think she's given us a sense of the positive energy that will go into bringing it back to life once again. So I think, can I ask you to say, not just a thank you to her once again, but to wish her well in the ongoing project.
Questions now, if anybody's got anything they would like to ask.
I'm conscious there's wine about to be poured. It's not out yet.
There's one at the back there.
It's, you know, I remember going through the tours about a year before the second fire, and you got tours around the building, but there was no evidence at the time of any fire compartmentation. And I totally agree with the imaging and things, you know, the character of the building you're trying to get. Yet my concern was when I saw on the telly after the fire, the workmen throwing the curved stone copings off the top of the wall with no listed building consent. And it's just, you know, that's the thing I'm struggling with, because if at the time the emergency reaction failed to protect as much as possible, then, you know, you're ending up having to recreate artificialness, where a much earlier approach that you, I'm sure, would endorse if you had the ability to do so, but it's, you know, there was no listed building consent for the demolition work that proceeded when I chased up Glasgow Council.
Oh no, there is. There's definitely.
Sorry, at the time there wasn't when it started.
No, we didn't know it was going to go on fire. The listed building consent was put in as soon as we could, but obviously on the day after, or the 2 days after, we didn't have an LBC. We had an LBC for the restoration of it. We obviously met with Building Control and Ian Mason of Glasgow City Council, who's the head of the Heritage Department, and immediately started speaking about it. So we lodged one almost immediately, but just said we'll have to tell you when we finished, as you say, pushing those stones in and see where we get to, because we could only say at that point we were going to take off the destabilised masonry. And you're quite right, we took a decision there to put the masonry into the building very quickly. Mainly it was all the squared, what would you call the plain rubble. So the first phase of the project was lifting things off. So they were slung, taken off, and have gone off to store. So all the coldstones and all the, I won't say crows, but any of the decorative stone. If it was too dangerous for the contractor to do it, they wouldn't, and we could put them in. There was a lot of stuff, in fact the majority of the stuff was taken down into the building, obviously not into the street but down to the building, because the option otherwise was that the council would have asked us to demolish. If we'd have taken the very slow route of hand dismantling everything that we took off, we wouldn't have a building to talk about. So it was pure pragmatism at the end of the day. I just want to come back to the first thing you said as well about compartmentation of it, because yeah, you'll have gone around. We actually took a lot of people through the building in the construction phase, and there was full compartmentation in the building. I mean, insofar as there were fire doors at there were, so I can show you the drawings. There were fire doors at every single doorway. There were fire extinguishers at every single door. There was fire detection at every level. And to be honest, and I know you work in plan area, we wouldn't have been able to operate a building site without that. They would have closed us down if we were, you know, it was at the start of the project, there was concern of, well not concern, there was certainly an option of whether or not we inhabited, this is the 214 fire, inhabited the eastern half, let me get it right, the eastern half of the building, because it was so undamaged, and that met every building control standard there was. We'd already enhanced that and put in additional fire doors. And you know, on a site, you're not allowed to work on a dangerous site. We would have had to have that in, and it was in. Otherwise, HSE who visited, the council who visited. So it had already been enhanced, and they were always checked, and they were always shut. So it had all the things. It was certainly not an easy building to fire compartment, because the studios were 9 metres tall and 10 by 11 metres in size. They were vast spaces. And what we didn't want to do is put up rabbit boxes throughout the entire building, because that would have destroyed what you were there for. But working within that building, it met every level of compartmentation you could do without, as I say, destroying it to do it. So it was meeting that balance, and it met regulations to do it. Sorry. Yeah,
Any other questions?
You made it clear, first of all, thank you. You made it clear it's now reconstruction, but where does the decision, you reference the borough charter, where does the philosophical decision sit as to the approach to be taken reconstruction?
No, I think that's a discussion we are really wanting to start having with a group, a large group, and more than one group of people. So we've had the kind of talks that we've had with the council, with HES. There's a lot of other people who have views about the Mackintosh, and I think we just want to hear it. When we're slightly at the point, the project at the moment is, I should have explained at the start, still has Scottish Fire and Rescue in the building. So we're slightly at an impasse. So the contractors are on site, they're still doing the safety works and the clearance works, and that's one of those corridor slides I showed you for the fire and rescue to go in, because they're still looking at the cause of the fire, which is still unknown. And when that is finished, they go out. At the moment it's their scene, so we're not allowed just to go in and move things around. And when they have finished, and when they write the report, which we hope will be early-ish next year, then we'll be able to go in, and I think, but in advance of that, you're quite right, this is the time to have those discussions. I think what we'd like to have is a full-scale survey of the building once all the debris is removed, an ongoing survey just to find out what is going to have to come off. That condition of stone on the inside is worrying for us, and we know there'll have to be a lot more downtaking to happen, but at least we can do that in our own time, and as the gentleman at the back said, you know, doing it properly stone by stone then at that time, without the council and a bulldozer breathing down our neck at the same time.
Any other questions? I was going to ask about kind of, I think following on from what Claire said about kind of the vision of the reconstruction, whether there's an assumption that it's going to be a straight reconstruction to as close as possible to what it was, or whether now there's more potential for doing things differently.
I kind of don't know the answer to it yet. I know the school said very early on, as they did after the 214, it will be rebuilt, and I think that's definitely how, i.e. it will be saved, it will be brought back into use again as part of the operational estate, and there's a real feeling that this mustn't become a museum, it should always be something that is used for the way Mackintosh intended it to be designed. We were already making changes to part of the last project, certainly in terms of taking off later accretions to the building, wiring and things that had been overclad, etc. We were kind of stripping it back to a 1909 view of the building, and it was incredibly modern in how it was shaping up, just taking it back to Mackintosh's original. So I think there's not a lot wrong with how Mackintosh had designed his building, but on the technology side I think there'll be a lot more we can actually do, because we are going to be building it in, so we don't have to go looking for places to hide services. Let's say, you know, we can build it in with the bricks this time and be cleverer perhaps about some of the problems, you know, that otherwise crop up about how to, things like the sustainability aspects of the building. I think we can think, but it's moving so fast. One of the things we were told in doing the last project was, don't bother putting in sockets, because by the time you open, March 2019, you won't need sockets. This is from a design school, of course, because it'll be in the ether, and we do have wireless charging now, but it wasn't here, so we were putting in sockets. But that will have changed by the time we get this building. I think by that time we won't need sockets by the time we get this building open again. So things like that.
Anybody got any other questions? You're all desperate for the glass of wine. Should we give Liz a final round of applause then? Can I just ask, if you have nobody done an event questionnaire, if you leave it lying around on your chairs, you will come and find them.